President, fellows, guests, thank you very much for inviting me along here this evening to tell you something about the work that we've been doing, that Historic Scotland has been doing on Iona during the last couple of years. The purpose of this work has been to completely represent the Abbey, which, as you can see, is now largely reconstructed, or at least the later medieval Benedictine phase of it from the 1200s onwards was reconstructed in various parts of the 20th century and is in use today by the modern day faith community, the Iona community that many of you will have heard of. And it came into the care of Historic Scotland in about 2000, and since then really we had a decade of catching up of repair and consolidation and conservation work on the major masonry buildings. But the opportunity came within the last 2 years to get to the much more interesting heart of the matter, which was to try and engage with the reality of particularly the early Christian, the fugitive early Christian remains of the ritual landscape associated, of course, with St. Columba and his successor abbots from the 560s onwards. And really, it's looking at the early origins of the site, establishing why Iona and its association with the saint became so important, and it eventually became one of the most important places in Western European early Christianity. And this is something that our visitors have found very difficult to engage with, because they see, of course, the reconstructed, the 20th century reconstruction of the buildings, and many come with some kind of knowledge or belief, knowledge about Columba and what happened at the zenith of the monastery, which following on from a pattern that Columba had established. And they find it very difficult to engage with that, and of course it's not been particularly well explored or presented. So that's really what we've been doing, and we've completed that project and the representation and the new museum, which you'll be seeing of the early Christian, the wealth of early Christian sculpted monuments that we have on Iona, including, of course, the high crosses. So we'll be exploring something of that and revealing a lot of the memories that are lurking in this landscape, some hiding in plain sight. Now, of course, the place is very much on the edge, but in the 600s and 700s, it was very much at the heart of the Irish kingdoms in the north of Ireland and their kin in Dalriada, the kingdom of Argyll, just over the water. And this was essentially a shared culture, language, and politics, which brought together these two geographical areas very closely, linked, of course, by the easy way of getting around, which was by the water. And of course, there's been recent work done about how the water not only allowed people to get ahead and to communicate and keep in contact, but also how it actually acted as a cultural accelerator as well. So we'll be examining evidence which shows that Iona was one of the most important monasteries of the Western Church at this time. Its location, one of my old friends here said, "I'm very glad that you're talking to us about Iona tonight, because it's much too far to go to." Its location is only 75 miles west and a bit north of Glasgow, but of course it takes you hours to get there because of the deep fjord-like sea locks and difficult terrain, which by land is still a challenge. But of course in these days, where these communities were masters of water and sea travel with their light skin-covered wooden boats, that was certainly not the case. I'll be referring a lot to Abbot Adamnan, who was the 9th abbot, successor of Iona, towards the end of the 600s, and wrote a life of Columba, the Vita, which gives us a tremendous cultural framework of real places, some of which you can still absolutely identify. And this is something that Peter Fowler and I were talking about earlier this evening from his experience of working on Charles Thomas's excavations there in the 1950s, and I'll be talking about that as well, and about new material and new understandings of those as yet unpublished excavations. So the life of Columba is very important, and Peter was talking about the attempt that was made through in the research design of Charles's excavations to link the archaeology to that historical narrative held within the life of Columba, which is a very interesting approach. But of course, making meaning out of myth, the title refers to the considerable challenge that we face when tackling the reinterpretation of a place like Iona, freighted with the baggage of centuries of myth-making and folklore. To steer a clear path through this was very difficult, ensuring that Historic Scotland could make this unique place more accessible and comprehensible, avoiding pitfalls and easy paths of popular mythology, which the place is dripping in. And I had a very good direct experience of this when on one ferry trip, one of the numerous ferry trips I had in the last couple of years, going over from Oban to Mull to then drive to Finnefort to get the wee ferry to Iona. And there are coachloads, often coachloads of North American tourists with their guides. And you go past Duart Castle, the great castle of the MacLeans of Duart, one of the great clan chiefs of the West Highlands, just on the promontory on Mull, just as you're coming into the harbour. It's wonderful, used in many film sets. And as they were going past, I couldn't help but overhear the guide telling them, yes, MacLeans of Duart, they made all their money out of toothpaste. and they believed them. And of course, you know, the truth is always much, much more interesting. So that's been quite a difficult challenge for us, because people go there thinking about these myths, that there was a very different kind of Celtic Christianity, which was much more about connection with nature and personal spirituality. And Columba was, he was almost Presbyterian, which was certainly not the case. They believed that he was the missionary and he was the evangelist of Scotland. Well, that was not true either. He was much, much too important as a member of the ruling O'Neill kindred in one of the great kings of dynastic kings of Ireland. He was an aristocrat, he was patrician, he fitted right in. He could go to the king of the Dalriada at Dunad and say, here I am, here's who I am, and I need some land for a monastery, and he would be given it. So that was very important, because he fitted right in. He was great diplomat. He was immediately recognised as a very important person. One of the other myths that the place was deserted after the terrible Viking raids in the early 800s. Well, there certainly were terrible Viking raids, and some of the community did go to Kells, but paradoxically, as we'll see, the life of the monastery, if anything, was stronger in the 800s in terms of the evidence of the material culture that they left behind. The relics were taken away. Well, the saint, as we know, the saint would never desert his place of burial, so some of the relics did go, but not all of them. Right, so the place of firsts. This is one of the ideas that it's important to get. There we are, conveniently, the arrow showing where we are, and of course a rather different kind of imagining of the usual sort of north-south depiction, a cartographic depiction that we see of Britain's place in Europe, and of course this is them looking towards Rome, looking towards Jerusalem. They were right out on the edge, there's no doubt about that. But what was Columba's aim? Well, it was very simple. His aim was to establish nothing less than the perfect monastery, and to recruit the ideal people who would make it the perfect monastery, and in so doing be delivering one of the demands of Scripture. We see a precocious involvement in European terms of the ordination of kings at Iona, and directly at Columba's hand. We see the first great saint's tomb shrine of the Irish type being constructed sometime after immediately at the opening of his tomb, probably sometime around about just shortly after 7:30, not 7:30 in the morning. We see the first high crosses being created here of the Irish type, and the relationship with the great high crosses of Northumbria is something which has not really been properly explored or explained. We see possibly the first marking graves, this materialization of Christian death through the erection of cross-marked stones. We have many, many surviving cross-marked stones from the 600s and 700s and 800s at Iona, many of which we've redisplayed in the new museum. And this, one thing that I always have to remind myself of, that this was still a time when many aspects of what we have bred in the bone as an understanding of Christianity, many aspects of Christianity were just crystallizing and still developing at this time. It's a very different form of faith. We probably wouldn't recognize many aspects of the faith if we went back in time to the later 500s at Columba's monastery. The essence, of course, is unchanged, but ideas such that we take for granted of putting crosses up over Christian graves, that was quite new around this time, and Iona may have played a part in this. They may be the first book written in Britain and Ireland, the Cachach, written possibly by Columba, a copy of the Psalms, and the first in producing sacred texts and books. There are more written works, theological works, and works of canon law, for instance, from Iona, surviving from the 700s, from the 600s and the 700s, works of poetry in Gaelic and Latin, than there are from any other monastery in Western Europe. The first annual chronicle was produced in Iona, and the first protected laws as well. Adamnan's law of the innocents, protecting non-combatants. So I'm trying to build up a picture of what developed through the 600s and 700s as an incredibly important place, a great place of learning and scholarship, and a great place associated with arts and other forms of Christian artistic production. Here's the site and the outline of the Vallum going around here on the north side, extremely well defined. The Vallum being the enclosing bank and ditch, with the monastery at the heart of it. And we can be pretty certain that Columba's monastery and the site of the church has been very, very conservative and has persisted as to where the later Benedictine church grew up. So it's underneath the larger church. And of course there have been various excavations in the area, particularly between the church and the little mortuary chapel of St. Oran's and the cemetery here, originally the monastic cemetery of Religorum, which in later medieval times became the burial place of the MacDonald Lords of the Isles, the kings of the area. The Vallum runs through this area here, marked in red, and this is the area that Finbar McCormack a number of years ago did cut a section through the ditch and bank of the Vallum, but surprisingly got this radiocarbon date of about 2,000 years ago. So it starts to build up a picture that, although we know for sure, excavations that again Charles Thomas and Peter Fowler were involved with on Dunvorach, the little Iron Age fort on the west side of the island, that there was obviously a community living on the island before Columba came along. And that's introduced a very interesting idea that there was not just an important community living at this spot, but one which may have had some kind of druidical, pre-Christian importance. Because we find a record of Plutarch from the later 1st century AD, who records after the battle of the success of the Roman army in the Battle of Mons Graupius, a reconnaissance of the Isles of Britain being ordered by the emperor. They sailed to the nearest of these, occupied by a small number of holy men, held sacred by the Britons. And this description suggests the Inner Hebrides and possibly Iona. So it could already have been a hallowed place, and this could well have been something that Columba was very much aware of before he arrived there. There have been finds of 1st and 2nd century Roman pottery from the site of the Abbey, and so it was definitely not a remote and uninhabited place. And I think the well could have something to do, the well that's outside the front of the church could have something to do with this as well. I will lift up mine eyes to the hills from whence my Redeemer shall come. So they were being instructed by Scripture to go to, even unto the ends of the earth, to bring the Christian faith to the known world. This was a particular challenge as to where they were, because this area had always been outside the Pax Romana. This was the barbarian country, and they saw themselves as island soldiers. They're described in the literature of the time as island soldiers. They were a bulwark against the Antichrist and the devils that lurked in the sea beyond. And of course there was a tremendous impetus to spreading the faith, not that Columba did that himself, but because they had a belief that the second coming was imminent, and that they had to fulfill this demand of Scripture to spread the faith even unto the ends of the earth before Christ would come. And where would he come from? He would appear in the east, and that's the direction that we're looking at here in this picture. This view has not changed since Columba was there, looking across to the cliffs, volcanic cliffs of Mull, just over the sound of Iona. And this is the view that they would have seen as they stood facing east outside the church in the attitude of prayer, fully expecting Christ to appear to them. We were able to, by putting together all of the understanding, the research and the archaeology, we've been able to carry out some new reconstruction drawings, including this very helpful one that gives you a very good idea. It's from that same viewpoint as the aerial photograph that I showed a couple of minutes ago. And it shows you the double enclosure, this idea which comes through in canon laws which were written at Iona, the collections of canon laws of the 700s, about the ideas of sacred space and increasing who could come into which bit, basically. And obviously coming into the Holy of Holies, and as time passed, that became not just the church at the centre of things, but the tiny stone-built shrine chapel immediately outside the church, which contained the, by then, elevated bones of the saint. So this is what's called the Street of the Dead, Strach na Marv in Gaelic, which brings pilgrims or visiting kings, whoever, up from the landing place at Martyr's Bay. And they come through the various entrances marked by crosses, as Alan tells us, and eventually takes you to the high crosses in front of the shrine chapel. Lots of smoke billowing, as ever, and there is a very good reason for that, in that all of the excavations over the years since Charles Thomas's in the 1950s have revealed large amounts of industrial debris, both from banging big bits of iron and right the way through to incredibly fine metalwork production. And there's that same view with a very recent set of geophysical data applied to it, giving you the varying. This is a palimpsest, of course, so we've got really no idea, but we have essentially the same outline of the outer vallum, and with the line of it going through approximately here. And anybody who's been here and sat and had dinner in the St. Columba Hotel, which is a lovely hotel right next to the site, you'll have sat right on top of the outer vallum because it runs through there. And I think it was Richard Rees did some excavations in the garden at the back of the St. Columba Hotel and found part of the vallum out there. and another big early Christian cross lamp. This enclosure here is very interesting, but looks a bit prehistoric. So geophysics has been turning up some very good results. Similarly, in 1979, and I know that John Barber came here soon after, in fact, to talk about his excavations, and the cemetery extension at Iona, which is outlined in red there. This is really the only decent large-scale modern excavation that has been carried out at Iona, and they found some very, very important results, and part of this reconstruction drawing is based on those results indeed. And a plan of that with the, so that's right on, here's the Street of the Dead going towards the church, and here's the Street of the Dead going towards the church here. And this is still extant, and we know from these excavations that it was almost certainly constructed in the mid-700s. Very, very finely constructed, great lumps of red granite from Mull. And what they found in these excavations, this is the outline of the cemetery extension in use now, was a very large ditch, and the terminal of the ditch, which of course, if you're digging a ditch, you want to dig in the terminal because that's where people tended to throw things away, and found a remarkable array of material, particularly down in the lower fills, which date from the early 600s and were waterlogged, so there was preservation of organic material from wood turning, from making lovely little porridge bowls that the monks were eating their porridge out of, and lots of leather shoes. There are more early medieval leather shoes from this little stretchy ditch than I think there are from the whole of Ireland. And you'll be seeing a little bit more of that. But also, very importantly, he found the remains of an enormous roundhouse, 18-metre diameter, timber roundhouse, much larger than any that have been excavated in early monastic sites in Ireland. And of course, I think it's important to emphasise that culturally this is an Irish site. It is just really from an accident of history how the kingdom of Dalriada eventually successfully grew into the 800s to become the origins of the kingdom of Alba, which of course eventually, with the amalgamation of the Pictish kingdom of the east and the Gallic Dalriada or Gael kingdom of the west, came together, and eventually medieval Scotland grew out of that. So if you like, if Alex Salmon was here, who is of course ultimately my boss, as I'm sure he would want to tell me if he was here, that this really is about this is about birth of a nation, really. And if you think about it, the development of dynastic kingships and how that grew from here into medieval Scotland and into the country that we know today, there is a strong resonance there, which politicians, of course, have been quick to recognise. And we could even see, ultimately this September in the referendum on independence, another chapter in that book being written. One of the extraordinary things, one of the amazing things, and this really goes back to Peter Fowler's comment to me earlier about excavating based on a historical narrative provided by Adamnan's Life of Columba and his description of crosses and the setting up of crosses associated with events in the life of the saint. Timber crosses, of course, at that time, which hadn't survived. And in book 3 of the Life of Columba, towards the end of his life, on the last day of his life indeed, after the saint left the barn and made his way back to the monastery, where he rested halfway, a cross was set up, fixed in a millstone. It can be seen today at the roadside. This could be that cross base in that millstone. Old millstones were regularly used to set up crosses. And of course, as well as the crosses, the handful of high crosses that we have surviving, there were a multitude of others which have been lost, and many of those were in timber. Here's the excavation going on in the base of the inner Vallum ditch. in the cemetery extension excavations in 1979, and the wealth of waterlogged material that came out of that, including the shoe that you see on the right-hand side there, and the wooden bowls and so on. And in this image here from St. Vigins, from Pictish, wonderful Pictish Royal Monastery, an amazing collection of Pictish cross slabs, that we have these two clerics with these lovely little boots on, and these are an absolute ringer for the boots, the style of boots that came out of the ditch. And also here we have the deacon illustrated in the Book of Kells, so early 800s, wearing exactly the same form of regulation leather footwear as well. One thing that it's been very important for us to try and do has been to try to get across the idea of that there is a lot more of the early Christian landscape, the ritual landscape of Iona, surviving than you would first think. And that in fact it's not fragmentary, it is a coherent whole as well. And that part of the unlocking of this has come from wonderful scholarship that's been going on in the last 20 or 30 years. And Thomas O'Loughlin has looked at De Locus Sancti, on the holy places, this supposed guidebook that Adamnon wrote in about 680 as a guide to the holy places of Palestine and involved in the Passion of Christ. And this when I first came across this was something that I struggled to come to terms with. So here was Adamnon, who'd never gone much further than Jarrow and various places in Ireland, writing a guidebook which was picked up, used, copied, and referred to regularly throughout the church in Western Europe for hundreds of years. And indeed there are still about 40 medieval copies of it surviving. And this is an illustration of it, from a slightly later copy, not an original version, but not far off, maybe even done by the same scribes who created the Book of Kells, in fact, the early surviving copy. And this is a plan of the Holy Sepulchre and Constantine's Basilica in Jerusalem. And it struck me as fascinating that there should be this strong interest, this very strong connection. And of course, in Thomas O'Loughlin's scholarship, he explains this very, very clearly. That of course, what in Columba's and his successors, their ambition for Iona to create this perfect monastery, of course, it was a perfect monastery model on the heavenly Jerusalem. And the way that you wanted to do that was to understand how Jerusalem actually was, or at least how it was in their minds. And that's exactly what they did. And so there's this, not so long ago it was always said there was this Bishop Arcliffe who washed up, he was a Gaulish bishop who washed up on the shores of Iona and had just come back, conveniently just come back from Jerusalem, so he explained it all to Adamnon, and Adamnon wrote it all down. No, I think poor old Arcliffe doesn't exist, and there is a common acceptance of that nowadays. So it wasn't a real pilgrim's guide, but actually a means of addressing problems and contradictions in Scripture. You can't have contradictions in Scripture. Scripture is the Word of God. But there are contradictions. Partly using topographical knowledge. The source, of course, you don't have to worry about the Bishop Arcliffe being washed up. There was a fantastic library, a university library, effectively, full of Latin and Greek and other works, Christian scholarship from across early medieval Europe in Iona that Adamnan had recourse to, and that's where he got a lot of it from. And of course, this is about them understanding their own landscape and creating their own landscape. And when you superimpose, here's a modern plan of what survives, a modern idea of the reconstruction of the Basilica and the Holy Sepulchre in its early form, and it is so close to what Abbey describes. So this struck me as being something that was very, very interesting indeed. And this was essentially the key for us to unlocking how to explain the pattern of ritual landscape that can still be detected on Iona today. And I juxtaposed these two images, the Strachan Marv, the Street of the Dead, the great processional way from the 700s with cross bases built into the side of it, heading towards the 3 crosses, very meaningful, of course, of the 3 high crosses, St. Oran's, St. John's, and St. Martin's, which stand outside the little shrine chapel, now engaged with the later medieval buildings, but for centuries stood on its own, which is essentially the Holy of Holies at Iona, and which, until a year ago, all our visitors coming to Iona didn't know what that was, or it wasn't pointed out to them, or its significance was not really recognised. So this was further explored in the collection of canon laws, in part written on Iona in the 700s. And Tommaso Carrigan, of course, who the great young scholar in Cork, who's written this wonderful book just recently about early Irish churches, which is the best source actually for reading about early Iona, because he includes, quite naturally, Iona in his survey. And he really goes to town on this idea that he sees that Irish sites were being modelled on Jerusalem, and that based on textual evidence alone, one would conclude that if ever this idea is given monumental expression, it was on Iona in the 8th century. So again, this is the best example that you can have. So this liturgical space was created specifically and perceived by the brethren on Iona as an analogue of the Holy City. The liturgy, and of course in the Psalms there are 57 references to Jerusalem. And so it was very important for them in their endless, constant exploration, exegesis of Scripture around the time of the Passion, reflected in their daily worship, that they understood that they could communicate with that they could get themselves back in time into it. So it enabled immersion in the contemplation of the Passion of Christ. On one hand, a distant land, while on the other, a familiar place. They knew well through Scripture, the Psalms, and through Adamnan's book, De Locis Sancti, enriching their own worship. Jerusalem was the centre of their worship, and interest in the holy places selected by God, places of crucifixion and resurrection, was just part of their core religious activity. Profound spiritual and scholarly interest existed at Iona, in Rome and in Jerusalem. And so they turned Iona into an icon of Jerusalem, and the space around it provides a key to the landscape the monks on Iona were seeking to create. And after all, in the elegy, the Ambra Columcilla, written just after his death, written down in the early 600s, one of the lines that is in there describing Columba is, "He knew Rome." And of course there were many within Rome. There were many examples of this recreated ritual landscape. Charles Thomas was in 1956, 1957, was newly appointed under Stuart Piggott as a young new lecturer in the University of Edinburgh, a lecturer in archaeology, and he was given an opportunity to excavate on Iona by George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community, as the buildings of the cloister were being reconstructed for use by the Iona community. And Charles, and with a stellar team, including Peter Fowler, Vincent McGaw, and Elizabeth Burley and others carried out a number of seasons of small-scale excavations. Sadly, Charles never published that result. This is Adrian Maldonado, who's a great Pictish scholar in Glasgow University. He and I, just over a year ago, we went down to Truro with a big car, and Charles very kindly allowed us to unload. He described it, you've taken a load off my garage and a load off my conscience. With all of this material, because for one thing, in displaying the new museum, we didn't want to, we were very much focusing on the carved stones, on the sculptural evidence and crosses. But also we wanted, of course, to get across a full idea of the richness of the material culture and everyday life of the monks in the 600s and 700s, and a lot of that is in some of the material that Charles had excavated. And also, of course, we're going to go ahead and publish this material. And it contains a wide range of material, some of it very, very small, like most of these objects, which can tell us a great deal about what was going on there. And Ewan Campbell in the Department of Archaeology in the University of Glasgow, who's a great scholar, of course, of material culture of this period in Scotland, is working with us on this collection, which is incredibly important. And it includes a complete range of every part of the process of designing and creating very fine metalwork, cast metalwork, copper alloy and gilded material. Everything from, on the top left here, a little bit of slate with compass drawn cross of arcs on it, little pin mould here for a dress pin, highly vitrified tiny fragments of crucible with little traces of silver within them, a very finely formed, what I think is maybe part of a frame for a book cover, and one of the stones used in stretching calf hide in the manufacture of vellum, and of course in the production of the great manuscripts that were being produced in Iona, like the Book of Durrow and the Book of Kells. There were literally hundreds of calf hides involved in that. Here's Ewan Campbell examining some of this material, and ranging from extraordinarily fine, well-preserved window glass. This is window glass. This is the oldest window glass in Scotland. This is from a little window, maybe in the church, that Adamnan may have looked through. And right down to the beautiful little glass bead. They were making a very fine glass on Iona, maybe for liturgical purposes, but also they had that ability in an age of an economy of barter and gift exchange. It was very important to be able to have materials that you could exchange. And they, of course, had the wherewithal. They had monks who were blacksmiths, they had monks who were silversmiths, and monks who were glass workers, to be able to make. I don't think the monks were wearing this lovely little blue glass bead about an inch long. I don't think the monks were wearing these. I think they were manufacturing them and trading them, but others may have other ideas. And in the process of doing that, of course, there's a lovely little head, which Charles had previously published in one of his books on early Christian archaeology, which could come from something like, well, that's a rather later shrine reliquary of St Manuel in Ireland, or it could be the head of a little pin, head of Christ or head of a saint. A lot of evidence of early ritual activity immediately in front of the forecourt, in front of the church, including divination, of taking action. Here, in the case of turning stones, ballons that you see on many Irish sites, and this action of having a large natural boulder of granite and taking another stone, in this case descriptions, contemporary descriptions, noble globes of white granite, and these stones, or a particular stone, has its own Gaelic name at Iona, the Clach Gra. And this was the endless turning. And we can only imagine on these stones here, which are now lying up against the the wellhead just outside the entrance to the church. How many turns, how many people must have turned that while putting up some prayers, taking some specific ritual action, some numbers of turns, in which particular way. And the prophecy is that once the stone wears right through, that's going to be the end of the earth. And some of these are worn right through, so you're on borrowed time. And the wellhead itself, the importance of baptism within this new faith and within this monasticism, which hadn't existed before, the creation of a new life in Christ that you entered into when you were baptized to become a monk. And don't imagine for a moment that any of this is about nice sort of pastoral stuff. This is very much internal to a very intellectual monastic community. So much of this. And that process and the importance of having the arrangements for baptism. And I do wonder if the well, which may be pre-Christian in its origins, and had a determining factor in the layout of the early site. And also this object, which just sits outside the front of the church door, and this could be the object referred to again by Alenon as there's a footbath he describes at one time when they're dashing to get back for the feast of Columba on the 9th of June. And Columba makes the weather all good because that was one of the things that Columba could do. And they get back in time, just in time for one of the services, I can't remember which one. But of course, before they go in, they describe washing their feet. And this object, again, which has its own specific name in Gaelic, with this lovely little cross on one end, and is one of my colleagues doing a bit of experimental archaeology with it as well. The little shrine chapel, this is it outlined in blue, and Dryden's wonderful 1875 drawing here with a couple of little kists shown inside it. And this has been rather overlooked as well. This wonderful sort of forecourt in front of it with remarkable, very fine grave slabs, early grave slabs. And so and this is something Thomas O'Carrigan has looked at very closely and really has come to the conclusion that this is the type, this is the very first one. And based on the small evidence that we have, and of course the image in the Book of Kells of the temple in Jerusalem, which they must have referred, the only source they had was their own church buildings, that we created this little reconstruction which shows two kists above ground over where the original grave of Columba must have been, which were contained very important reliquaries that this incredible event, the opening of Columba's grave in the 730s maybe, would have been the most famous, most celebrated event in the insular church that really had almost ever happened. There was a reticence to open the grave, of course, because of the power that this great saint, who is regarded as almost like an Old Testament prophet in terms of his powers, if you read his miracles in Abbey. And so we have had a bit of fun there, using some real objects and some imagined objects to recreate a set of the reliquaries that were created, which must have been incredibly rich, because not only was this a great spiritual event, this would have been a great political event as well, and it would have prompted enormous interest from kings and nobility in Pictland and in Ireland when it happened. And the erection of St. John's Cross, this of course is the concrete replica because it kept falling down, because it's an experimental object. They didn't really know what they were doing when they made it. But its relationship with the little shrine chapel and the way that you get this shadow of the cross falling directly on top of it is an absolutely planned and intentional thing. There is the image of the temple, Christ up in the temple being tempted by the devil. The devil's the horrible little flying black chap, a black-coloured chap on the right-hand side there. And here we see maybe an image of an early church or little shrine chapel. And of course we have objects like the Monymusk reliquary shown there, which of course at a microscopic scale, you can hold that in the palm of one hand, were reliquary containers, portable reliquary potatoes. And this was the great advantage of opening the grave. And that we know, well, Bede, writing around 730, he seemed to be under the impression that Columba still rested whole in his tomb. By the early 750s, Columba's relics are going on tour around Ireland, promulgating Columba's law and consecrating churches. So obviously between those two dates, the grave had been opened. So this gives us a very particular point in time for association, arguably, with a number of objects, with fragments of reliquaries that survive, none of them in Scotland now, and also for things like the high crosses, and also for the Book of Kells. This is what a slide that I call my Hammer House of Horror moment. Inside this is a kind of fisheye lens, so the interior of the chapel is absolutely tiny, and it's got a raised floor from its reconstruction in the early 1960s, because it's only the very base and the little buttresses on the west face at its foundation level, which are original. The rest of the thing has been reconstructed, sadly. Raise that floor, and then underneath, these two little kists are, well, they're not little, they're large stone kists, above ground sarcophagi, essentially, exist, and nobody ever sees them. And when Kate Forsyth, my excellent colleague from the Department of Celtic in Glasgow University, when I took her there and showed her these things, she said, Columba Adamnan. And that could well be true. We also have fragments of our architectural stonework. Here I've had a little bit of fun trying to make it into a stone screen for the inside of the church. And there's the one from Saint-Denis in Paris, which gives you some kind of idea of similarity. Now, we're moving on to the high crosses. And this was just to put them all together, and obviously to put Bewcastle and Ruthwell, and the two great Northumbrian high crosses, which are pretty much of the same period. So something was happening in the 720s, in the 730s, that prompted the creation of this enormous monumentalization of the cross, the central symbol of Christianity, which was such an effective way of broadcasting the essential message of Christianity, of the death, of the passion of Christ, his death on the cross, and his resurrection, and the promise of eternal life contained within it. It's an incredibly powerful symbol. It delivers all of that just within the outline of the cross, but it also has faces when you make it real in wood or in stone, which allow you to explore other aspects around that in both figurative and decorative, symbolic forms. And it's just interesting to put them all together. And through all of the reading that I've done, I've found no way of understanding the relationship between the Northumbrian high crosses and the ones appearing at pretty much the same time on Iona. So there's some interesting work to be done there. And you can deconstruct, I've got no time to do this, but you can deconstruct the complex, incredibly intellectually challenging and complex, multivalent levels of what, visitors nowadays, you can go and you can walk past it in a minute, St. Martin's Cross, without realizing. Here we are standing, we're facing it, we're facing east, we're standing in where the monks would have faced in terms of prayer and veneration, looking towards the east. And it essentially provides a complex explanation and concordance between the Old Testament and the New. You've got the incarnation of Christ and this Maria Angelorum, the Virgin and Child surrounded by angels chanting wonderful heavenly singing, and various Old Testament, much of it based on David, which helps to explain different aspects of the nature of Christ and the nature of his life and death. and as I say, we won't go into it there, but some of it's up on the screen. But the snakes down at the bottom, now this is I've found some very, very interesting indeed, and something which on first glance appears to be rather difficult to explain. But in fact, people like Jane Hawkes, particularly Jane Hawkes and Donald MacLeod, have published works looking at the purpose of this so-called snake and boss decoration, which is incredibly prominent on the high crosses. Sorry, I've just dropped in those nice little gilded. There are sockets on the ends. They worked out because St. Oran's was the wrong bit of stone, and it laminated along its length, and it fell down. St. John's was too enormous, and it fell down, and then they put the rings around it, mortise and tenon joints in stone, but it kept falling down as well. And they kind of got it right with St. Martin's. They used a different stone, and they lessened the length of the cross arms and put in these sockets, which on important days were these additional end pieces, which of course are long gone in some Norse Viking grave by now. But you also get this wonderful, extraordinary thing happening, and many of you will be aware of the work that Yeoman O'Carrigan, Tomas's dad, also in Cork, has done on the sun-wise explanation of how you could read different parts and understand different parts of the decoration and iconography of the crosses depending on the time of day and on the seasons and on the liturgical seasons as well. So there is enough within there for a monk in the 750s or 760s to stand in front of this face of the cross and to spend days exploring it in the way that we would use books and the internet today to explore aspects of the passion and the death and the resurrection of Christ, and the concordance between how that was prefigured in these Old Testament stories of the sacrifice of Abraham, the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, and David, of course, David writing the Psalms and so on, and just making that direct connection between the image of the Virgin and Child on Maria Angelorum and the images in stone on Iona. They are from exactly the same Mediterranean source, the image which is wound up on Iona. I'm not going to go into much detail about snakes, but there is quite a lot that you can say about the snake and boss, which is possibly performing is the same sort of Eucharistic function as Vine Scroll does on Northumbrian and Pictish sculpture of the same sort of period. Just showing the base, the original base of St. Martin's Cross, this little nib, and this is how we used that little nib. And here we are with some of Charles Thomas's material, or specifically this little lion, which is a wonderful thing. It is absolutely tiny. I mean, that's about an inch, that scale there. It's cast bronze, it's lost wax, casting. It's been horribly dealt with in conservation in the 1960s, so that any of the original surface is lost, but it would have been gilded, I'm sure. We've lost the little prick ears as well. And here is essentially the same image of a lion or a panther from the Book of Kells. There are over 100 images of lions prowling through the pages of the Book of Kells. There's an aspect of the life of Christ, or the character of Christ, the Lion of Judah, Lion of David. And one of the telling features is the treatment of the lion's mane here compared to the treatment of the lion's mane here on the Book of Kells, which of course we should call the Book of Iona. And here on the Bologna house shrine, you see sort of a different developed form of backward-looking a leonine creature on the top of the little house-shaped shrine. And here on St. Oran's Cross, a couple of backward-looking lions there. and there's just a detail. This is we don't know where this little one, this is a Scottish one, that was found in Scotland, but we don't know where it's come from. And there's a detail of it with its backward-looking head and its teeth and so on. And so the objects that we have associated, potentially, likely associated with the Shrine of Columba include this little plaque, which is in Copenhagen now, the Romfro Helen plaque, which has snake boss decoration, which we argue is an Iona brand, basically, very highly identifiable. Here, we're looking down on the flattened sort of heads of a number of snakes, and they all have this strange sort of duck-like quality to them. And on the Saint-Germain plaques, these are two little sort of 6-inch long butterfly finials from an incredibly beautiful and important reliquary of the sort of 8th century date. And here is comparison with some of the carved snake embossed. You see it a bit better there, and you can make specific comparisons. Here on the cross head of St. Orange, you've got these two snakes clamping a human head within their grasp, and the same in here. And these terminals to these snake bodies are puffins, I think. I think they're puffins. Lots of puffins in the inner Hebrides. And when you make the comparison between the snake boss decoration on St. Martin's and the little much smaller central ones, and these are coils, remember, these aren't interlaced bosses, these are coils. And there's a whole other story about Asclepius and Hygeia in Greek mythology, and about St. John and what happened to him, but we won't worry about that just now, because I'm just going to show you, finish off now and show you what we've been able to do. This is the old museum, which was essentially a warehouse for stones, interpretation-free zone, with St. Oran's cross, of course, which can't support its own weight because it's lost half of its shaft through lamination. It's a poor selection of stone. These were the first stone high crosses that were made. They didn't know what they were doing. These were carpenters who transferred to working in stone. But also just the removal, the great logistical challenges that we had, and also the great opportunities for study. These are Edinburgh University postgrads. And here's St. Oran's with our mount maker, Richard West, in his workshop in Selkirk, where we demounted it, taken it away, and we then gave him this difficult challenge of creating obviously strongly engineered, over-engineered mount of steel, but recessive, not obscuring any of the important decoration. There's just the kit of parts which we've been dealing with. There is there's the site as it was up until a year ago, in the Infirmary Museum on Iona. So it's one of the reconstructed Benedictine monastic buildings. It was reconstructed for this purpose. Its interior has lots of pine in it. It was sort of like a 1960s Swedish sauna, and that's what we've been able to transform that into. Just providing it's just nice and simple. We've been working with people like Kate Forsyth and others, working out a nice straightforward chronology and as much as you can for the stones. They're not easy, not that easy to certainly the great mass of crossmarked grave slabs, to be able to differentiate between them stylistically and period-wise. But nevertheless, we've had a go at that and created a very simple black box, well actually it's a blue box interior, but based obviously on this major piece of research which we've carried out, and enabling identification of key sculpture for display, which are also representative of key moments within the history of Iona. And chief amongst this was to provide a context for the sudden appearance of the monumental first Celtic high crosses in the mid-700s, which we straightforwardly associate with the elevation of this great treasure, the portability, the accessibility of the relics of this great saint, and the investment that and patronage that would have prompted from Ireland and from Pictland particularly at that time. Informed chronological groupings of sculpture and artefacts, establishing the essential layout, selection of materials and palette informed by the need to create simple, timeless displays within a welcoming atmosphere where the design is attractive but secondary to the objects themselves, with some seating, and all intended to encourage visitors to do the one thing that they never did: look at the stones. So we've got a simple chronological layout, a high-level timeline, which you see going around the top with these abstract sort of time dots in it. We also include the later West Highland sculpture from the period of the Lords of the Isles, from the 1300s to the 1500s, but I can't say anything about that tonight. And around the central focus of the three great high crosses, St John's at the front, St Oran's to the left there, and St Matthew's on the right-hand side, which is a bit later in the 800s. We decided that this key, simple understanding of how the crosses were to be read sunwise, and how the different illuminations of the sun and indeed the moon at different times of day in the summer, if you had the sun, which it was a period of coming into a period of climactic optimum in the 700s and 800s, so that's okay. It was a bit nicer to live there then. So we've done that, and we've coupled it with a 24-hour soundscape of what life of work and worship in a day in the summer on Iona might have been in the mid-700s, and combined with that a recording done for us by Gilbert Marcus, who is a great early Gallic scholar and incredibly knowledgeable about this period. And I met him at a conference one day, and I said, how did these, because he has transcribed early Gallic and Latin poems written on Iona, and which would have been sung. And I asked him, where can I get some recordings of these? And he said, well, they've never been recorded, because we've no idea what they sounded like. But he was a Dominican friar, and before he stopped being a Dominican friar, and he is very knowledgeable on very early church music. And so at this conference, in having coffee, he started to sing for me. And I said, stop, we've got to record you doing this and get it into our soundscape. And that's exactly what we did. And you're going to see some images and hear the song, which has probably never been heard for 1,000 years. And Gilbert singing it as we go through some of the sun cycle. Well, that's probably quite enough for me. I'm just going to conclude now. I hope I've given you a little taste. Well, I've given you a little taste there of a lovely exhibition that we've been able to put together on Iona, and very much to encourage people to go and see it for themselves. It's not really that far away, and it's a fantastic experience. And I would recommend, if you go, stay a night. It's a completely different experience. Stay a week if you can, but stay a night and explore some of the island with your copy of Adonan's Life of Columba. It's a very rewarding experience. And I'm just going to say in conclusion, rather than being an outlier in the 700s of early Irish monastic tradition, we can now see that Iona, its shrine chapel and its high crosses, was leading the way with experimentation and innovation, evidenced in the creation of the first stone buildings and high crosses, as well as in the wide variety of other arts and crafts. This process, spurred on by the elevation of their great treasure, the bones of St. Columba, may have prompted greater levels of patronage. we can also postulate that this cultural revolution went hand in hand with important contributions to monastic practices, theology and doctrine, with ripples sent out from this wee Hebridean island lapping onto the shores of Western Europe. The ultimate culmination of this being the production of the greatest early gospel book, the Book of Kells. The monastery was strong enough to ride out the Viking incursions and lived on to develop through the 800s. And our new interpretation and visitor facilities allow an understanding of this as never before, at the very special place where all of this happened. Truths far more exciting than any myths. Please do visit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that wonderful talk. I really enjoy always the sense of monastic continuities, and you're putting in place there a sense of there is more of a story from those early centuries that we imagined. It's very timely, I think, to make us think about that as well as the present communities of people who go to Ireland and those who live there.
I'll just tell you a little anecdote that illustrates something very interesting to me. When I was up at the north end of the island speaking to one of the crofters who runs some sheep up by the White Strand of the Monks, and he has 250,000 visitors every year walking across his land, going up there, and not everybody always being very respectful of his land and of his sheep. And but he was a lovely guy, and I had a really nice chat with him. And people in Iona have a lot of time to spare, which is a lovely thing. And so he was leaning on one side of his fence, and I was standing on the other. And I was telling him what I was doing, what we were doing at the Abbey, and trying to sort of enthuse him about it, and about the new displays and so on. And he leaned over to me and he said, "Now, you see that Columba fella? He came from Ireland, didn't he?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Well, I wish he'd bloody stayed there." So these things are, wonderful cultural places for us, but there's always a bit of a sting in the tail somewhere, especially for the people who are trying to farm in the area.
Thank you. Some questions then, please, for our speaker tonight. Yes, Alison, yes.
You obviously enjoying yourself myth busting. Would you look at the actual reasons why Columba came there? Why he came from Ireland when he was a prince, was fighting, leading in battles and so forth, and suddenly he comes to this island. I can understand Scotland, but off Scotland, really difficult place to get to.
Thank you. Any other questions, please? Yes.
I'd like to know if you've done any thinking about how the excavations and what you have learned about Iona might relate to the excavations at Port Mahoma.
There was another question.
Yes. You didn't mention, maybe deliberately, Torab.
I know what's coming.
Yes, I did warn you. Torab. For those of you who don't know the site, Torab is a little outcrop of rock which is in the centre foreground of the air photograph and the plan, looking at it from the west, which I excavated with my wife-to-be in the late 1950s. And why I ask this is, are we going back to it?
Yes.
There we are. So you've gone past it now.
Actually, can't even see
Yeah,
it
you've
now,
gone past it. Go back there.
There it is.
There it is. That's it. That's Torab, a little outcrop, which I presume means the Abbott's Rock.
Yes.
We excavated and found two things there. One, there was a construction on which we interpreted as a building, and there was a cross base. And we suggested in our interpretation of it, this is my question, is this interpretation accepted? We suggested that the little oval-shaped structure was a monastic cell, and indeed was specifically Columba's cell, as described by a dominant, or Adamant. I'd just like to know whether that interpretation, which is obviously historically based, I don't like doing archaeology that way, but whether that is now generally accepted and indeed is enshrined in your official interpretation.
Any more questions? Yes.
Morris, thank you. As a member of the O'Donnell family, I'm hoping there are no O'Neills in the room. Of course, the page you're talking about is incorrect, isn't it, to use either of those titles? He's a member of the Kingdom Con. He's a prince of the North of Ireland family rather than claimable by the later bifurcations of the family, the clans. And the other point, the way Columba and Iona are patriated into Scottish history, and whether the Irish should go back to Ireland or not. What about the fact that the whole of Western Scotland in the 19th century has an enormous Irish influx, and so much of Scottish Catholicism, which is such a large minority in your country, comes from Ireland, doesn't it, in the 19th century? Is that at all shadowed or foreseen in the way you present this site, or do you close everything down in 1560 and make, I know you don't, make Columba a Presbyterian?
One more, yes, please. Yes.
Just to say thank you very much indeed for a most encouraging and exciting presentation, and to congratulate the whole team, and particularly you, on what you brought together, because it's a very difficult place it's a wonderful place just to be, but to get all these disparate bits together. And just to tack on perhaps to Carol's query, if you're going to say a word or two about Port Muhammad, can we just have a word or two about Lindisfarne? Thank you.
I think that's plenty to get into. Yes.
How long have you gone?
It is.
Right. Why he came, the circumstances of his arrival in or around 563. Can't be sure about that. It's one of the myths. That there are, as you outlined yourself, a variety of different explanations of whether, well, he was supposedly excommunicated and had to go on what was called the White Martyrdom, leaving his own kindred, which was a terrible and very, very difficult thing for anybody to do. Your kindred in that society was your whole world. But he'd been a very successful founder of monasteries and political figure. He was already in his late 40s, I think, when he arrived. So he'd already had a notable and indeed quite difficult career at the height of society within the north of Ireland before he arrived. He was born in Donegal. So it's not something, I mean, different. There has been a lot of research and there is a lot written about the varying explanations of why he came, and I haven't really got anything to add to that. The reason for choosing Iona is much more straightforward, I think, and it seems to be quite a liminal place, as well as being, and you were referring to it being a remote place. Then it was not a remote place at all, quite the opposite. It was a very much a connected place, and it was easier to get across to the Glens of Antrim than it was to get over to Lindisfarne, or to cross the Dunalman, the spine of Scotland, the great mountain ranges that separate west of Scotland and east of Scotland, which culturally has separated Scotland. So, it seems that it was maybe a place that had already changed hands. It was maybe on the boundary between the kingdom of Dalriada and the Pictish kingdoms, and this was important, and this would have been very attractive to Columba, because although he wasn't going out and brothel advertising himself, he needed a base where that would be effective for that purpose. So in and amongst all of that sort of my rambling there is a sort of answer to your question. Port Mahomac and Carol is a very good question. It is believed to be something I have completely purposefully not gone into. The whole familia of Columba, the daughter houses and the spread of the Columban church and Columban type monasteries. Other incoming Irish saints were also available, like Monash and others, but Columba kind of is the top of the pile. And Port Mahomac and Martin Carver, there's amazing excavations there, have quite rightly associated that as being an outlier in a very, very significant place. And the dedication to St. Coleman at Port Mahomac, I think, is Columba. Actually, I don't think, I think Martin has tended to say that Coleman might have been a follower of, or a later monk from Iona, but I think it's just derived from Columcille. So yeah, I think that's the framework for the relationship between Iona and Port Mahomac. Peter Fowler and Toraba, or Toranaba, the little hill of the abbot. Yes, is the simple answer to your question. That your published report on that excavation I'm persuaded by it, and we interpret the site in exactly that way. That the oval stone base was for a superstructure of a little cell, probably with the sort of wattle, which he would have used as his writing out. It was a great location. He could have sat up there, as you said earlier, and he could look out over the sound of Iona, seeing who was coming. He could look down, seeing the activity, and kept an eye on his own monks from up there. And it has gone into a new guidebook in exactly those terms, with the later cross bases on the top, which marked it as a particularly important place. The question about the Irish and Roman Catholics and coming into the West of Scotland in the 19th century and the relationship to Columba is something that I know absolutely nothing about. There is a continuity of tradition in Scots Gaelic culture of Columba and Iona, which is an unbroken thread. That carries on right through to the present day. It's a tremendously important place. And to what extent this kind of reverse migration from Ireland in more recent times and how that fed into that, I'm not exactly sure at all, but I think it's a very interesting point. And certainly in the story that we tell, we don't end it at 1560 and the Reformation at all. And we bring it right up to date, indeed, into the 20th century with island life, what happened to the ruins of the monastery, how the place entered became much more than a religious curiosity, it became a fashionable place to visit, thanks to, as ever, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, amongst others, but also William Wordsworth and Sir Walter Scott and Felix Mendelssohn and so on in the 19th century. So we tell all of that story. We also tell the story of Crofton life to a little extent. But also we end it with the Ritchies, who were a couple who lived there up until the 1930s, 1940s, and effectively reinvented Celtic jewellery as we know it today. And that's a craft which is alive on Iona, with some very fine jewellery still being created. And the question about Lindisfarne, of course, something that I specifically, because it's another whole area of study of Lindisfarne in connection with the Anglo-Saxon Northumbrian kings and the founding of Lindisfarne as a daughter house of Iona in 625 is not really hasn't been something that we've gone much into, apart from the fact that it very much demonstrates the political influence, which of course really came a cropper with the whole business of the dating of Easter and the Celtic tonsure in the early 700s, which Adam personally saw the danger of, but if they didn't changes that Iona would become a backwater. But he managed in the early 700s and others after him to carry that one off, and it didn't become a backwater.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be brief then, and just say at the start of that, of your talk, of course, when you were talking about visitor expectation, that many people go to somewhere like Iona with all sorts of things they think they know or they want to believe about what happened there, and it's part of a kind of spiritual journey of a particular kind for many people. Of course, I started thinking about Kelmscott, and going to our site with a tremendous knowledge of William Morris. So you've got to that arc between the highly knowledgeable and people who might come there because they're doing the Scottish Islands. Some of your American visitors will be going around the islands knowing very, very little but enjoying themselves, and that's wonderful too. And giving a good offer to everyone to get what they want out of the place is clearly a challenge for all of us who look after historic buildings. But I thought, obviously, you've given us a wonderful overview with beautiful slides at the end of the present day presentation of the site. It's great news that Thomas's excavations are being explored and researched on, because there's no better way that you can keep exploring how you can emphasise those links with the past and the people living there. And this was even more vibrant community in St Columba's time and after, in terms of the numbers of people who were there than we had in many centuries since. That will help people make a connection. Those small objects are very vividly alive for us through